My wife got pregnant by her brother-in-law to have a child for her infertile sister, and now I'm the villain for wanting a divorce, while my family blames me. I never imagined that the beginning of the end of my marriage would start with a family meal that in theory was to celebrate a birthday. Everything seemed normal that day. Emily's father had turned 60, so they organized a dinner at her sister Karen's house. I went with the best attitude, as always, although at that time I was already beginning to notice that Emily was different with me. I do not mean a particular argument, but those slow changes, those gestures that one only catches when one knows someone well. She avoided my gaze when she spoke, she became more and more reserved with her routines, and what shocked me the most was that her cell phone had gone from being abandoned on any surface to becoming an extension of her hand, always with the screen face down and the notifications on silent. That night, however, she played the role of the perfect wife. She served me food, laughed at my jokes, even hugged me from behind while I was talking to her uncle. And I swear for a second I felt guilty for having doubted her. I did not know that this guilt was being injected into me on purpose. After dinner, when everyone already had drinks in hand, and the conversation revolved around the same old topic, the pregnancy that Karen and Dave could not achieve no matter how many treatments they tried, Emily intervened with a comment that at the time seemed innocent to me, but in retrospect was a kind of carefully calculated introduction. She said it was an injustice that such a good couple could not be a mom and dad, while so many irresponsible people brought children into the world without thinking about it. Karen cried, Dave nodded, and everyone around made those murmurs of forced empathy that people make when they do not really know what to say. I just squeezed Emily's hand tightly as if to say, I am here, without knowing that she had made a decision, without consulting me in the slightest. The following week became a collection of clues that I did not know how to read in time. Emily left the house frequently, sometimes saying she was going to accompany Karen to the doctor or that they would meet to keep her company and lift her spirits. It never seemed suspicious to me because I have always been one to trust first before distrusting. In those days, she also began to show a sudden interest in prenatal supplements. She told me she wanted to have her body in good condition in case we ever decided to have a child. It seemed strange to me, but I assumed it was her way of encouraging her sister by example or something like that. My mistake. One day I came home early from work. I had forgotten some important documents and had to go back before she returned. I am not one to go through other people's things, but her laptop was open and on the screen was an email that said, "Fertile calendar confirmed according to your last visit." It did not have a sender from a doctor or a hospital. It was a Gmail account with no name. When I saw that, something hit me in the chest. I took a picture out of instinct. Then I went into her old emails, and there I found a complete chain of messages between her and Adam, Dave's younger brother, Karen's brother-in-law. The words were clear, they did not need interpretation. They talked about dates, about how to disguise the meetings, about ensuring that the baby would have blood ties to the Joneses. In other words, Emily was sleeping with Adam to get pregnant and then give that baby to Karen. Supposedly, she was doing it for love, for family, for generosity. But at no point in that entire chain, and I reviewed it completely, did she mention me, not even once. Her husband, was just a piece that was going to be used to cover up the truth if necessary. I confronted her that same night. There were no shouts at first, just silence, as if she already knew I would find out sooner or later. I asked her if it was true, if she was pregnant with Adam's child. Her answer was that she did not know for sure yet, but yes, they had been trying. She told me it was her way of helping her sister, that I should understand that blood does not always make family, but sometimes it is the only thing left when everything else fails. She was so calm, so convinced that she was doing the right thing that for a second I doubted my own reaction. She told me she hoped I would accept it, that I would not say anything until everything was more established, because Karen did not know everything yet. I asked her what role I played in all of this, and she dropped a bombshell with a pleading face. I need you to sign as the legal father, so there are no problems. You and I will remain married, but this baby will be for her. She said it as if she were asking me to hand her a glass of water, as if what she was asking did not destroy everything we had built. That was the night I stopped seeing her as the woman I married and started seeing her as a stranger. I slept on the couch out of habit because I did not have the strength to leave immediately. But the next morning, before she even woke up, I packed a bag, called a friend, and left. From there, everything else began. The calls from the family, Karen's messages with a broken voice begging for understanding, Emily's attempts to make me feel guilty, the mutual friends who asked me not to react so drastically. What no one understood was that I had not chosen this, that they had used me as a facade, as a name on a birth certificate, as a lie with legs. And that was not the worst part. The worst part was that if I did not act fast, if I did not think with my head, and let my anger control me, I was capable of ending up as the legal father of a child that was not even mine. That was the part that hurt me the most, that in this country, if you are not careful, paper weighs more than the truth. So I decided to do what I had to do, even if they pointed at me as the bad guy, because if they had already taken my trust, at least I was not going to give them my dignity. Update 1. A couple of weeks had passed since I left the house with that improvised suitcase, and my mind was still in chaos. I was staying at Derek's apartment, a lifelong friend, the only one who did not judge me or ask, "Are you sure about what you are doing?" but offered me the couch and a spare key without needing any justification. In that time, I began to see everything more clearly, especially when the initial emotion turned into emotional exhaustion. During the first few days, Emily sent me some messages that changed in tone with each attempt. She started with, "We need to talk," as if what had happened could be resolved with a normal couple's chat. Then came the "Do not make this harder for everyone." And eventually the darts disguised as victimhood arrived, like when she wrote that, "If you decide to leave now, you will be destroying more than one life." What she did not say is that that life mine, she had already broken it herself without asking me. At the same time, Emily's family, whom I always thought cared for me, began to apply pressure from their side. Karen reached out to me first and left me an audio message that I listened to about 10 times because it seemed as twisted as it was sad. Her voice sounded tired, defeated, as if she were on the verge of breaking and trying to maintain a composure that was already slipping through the cracks. She told me she understood that it had all been a difficult decision for Emily, but that they did it with their hearts, and that at the end of the day, they were not hurting anyone because no one was going to lose anything. She said that she and Dave had dreamed their whole lives of being parents, that it was not fair that they biologically could not, and that if there was an opportunity for the child to be part of the family through an alternative channel, that is how she put it, alternative channel, she did not see why she should refuse. Then, as if that were not enough, she finished with something that stuck with me. "If you do not appear in the equation as the father, they are going to ask us questions, and that would affect the child. You were always so mature. I hope you do not change right now." The worst part is that she said it with tenderness, as if she truly believed that I had to accept all of this without protest, just so as not to ruin their story. But I had not changed. What happened is that I was uprooted from a narrative I did not build. No matter how much they tried to disguise it as a noble sacrifice, I knew that what they had done was nothing more than a betrayal orchestrated by functional adults who believed their cause justified anything. So I decided to act, and act quickly. I could not let the months pass and the baby be born while the law assumed that because we were married, I was the father by default. Because in this country, whoever does not make a move in time gets trapped in a process where biology matters less than a signature, and I was not going to give them that. I contacted a lawyer specializing in family law, not the typical one you get through a recommendation, but someone with experience in cases where you have to prove lack of consent and manipulation within a marriage. And I told him everything in great detail. I did not omit anything, not even the fact that I had been silent for weeks, because deep down I still had a hard time accepting that the woman I had shared my life with had used me as a legal shield to cover up a relationship with another man. The lawyer was clear. The first thing we needed was to prevent the child from being registered with my last name without proof. To do that, we had to gather evidence that I not only did not know about the pregnancy, but that there was also active opposition on my part. The immediate solution was to send a letter of intent to divorce with a formal request for paternity tests as soon as the baby was born. It was not a direct lawsuit yet, but it was a first step that made it clear I was not going to take on someone else's responsibility. The letter was sent with proof of delivery and a copy to her lawyer. 2 days later, Emily called me crying, but not with the soft voice from before. This time, it was a mix of frustration and indignation. She told me she could not believe I was exposing her like this, that it not only made her look bad in front of her family, but also in front of her friends and acquaintances. Because everyone thought we were expecting a child together, how could I be so cruel as to make this public now? And that is when I understood that what hurt her most was not what I had done, but that her disguise was falling apart. She told me that mine was not love, that it was pure wounded ego. And for the first time I felt nothing. No pain, no anger, no guilt. Just a kind of dry emptiness, as if I had flipped a switch inside. But that did not mean I was going to stand still. I spoke with a friend who works as a private investigator and asked him to do some non-invasive surveillance. Nothing illegal, just documenting if Emily had regular contact with Adam, if they attended medical appointments together, if there was anything to support the theory that all of this was planned with malice. And of course there was. In a week, I had photos, environmental recordings, and even a couple of screenshots of them entering the same clinic where Karen and Dave had their treatments together. I did not have the full puzzle yet, but the pieces were already on the table. Meanwhile, I was still sleeping on Derek's couch and going to work as if nothing had happened. I could not show any signs of weakness because it was already clear that Emily and her circle were making their move, making me look like the cold husband, the man who abandoned his pregnant wife, the insensitive one who refused to be part of an act of love. I knew that sooner or later all of that would backfire on them, but in the meantime, I needed to hold on, build my case, and calmly plan each step. Because if one thing was clear, it was that this was no longer just a divorce, it was a battle of narratives, and I was not going to let others tell mine. Update 2. Almost 4 months had passed since that first legal letter. Emily's pregnancy was now obvious, and by that point her entire family, her friends, and even distant acquaintances knew that we were expecting a baby. I say that in quotes because there was no way to escape that narrative. They had erased me from the emotional equation, but kept me at the center of the public story. Where I saw betrayal, they showed a twisted version of family generosity. They said I was the man who had chosen to give the greatest gift to his sister-in-law, and that far from being an act of kindness, it became a nightmare that I had to dismantle step by step. I knew I could not let the lie take root any further, because once a false image is established in front of everyone, reversing it is 1,000 times harder. So I decided that if they were going to make the pregnancy a campaign, then I was going to turn the truth into a bomb, and I was going to drop it right when it would hurt the most. The opportunity came sooner than I imagined. Emily, taking advantage of the fact that many people already knew about the pregnancy, organized a surprise baby shower at Karen's house, as if the idea had come from others and not from her. I found out from one of Emily's cousins who had not yet aligned with the theater and who had more common sense than the rest of the family. He told me via text, almost like someone giving a warning. "Hey, are you going to be at the baby shower? Because you are listed as a host on the invitation." I had to read that sentence more than once. Not only were they willing to maintain the lie, but they were using me as the main character in a story I never wrote. There were photos of me with Emily on the invitation taken before the whole debacle. Everything edited to make it look like we were expecting our first child, happy, united, radiant. That was the breaking point. It was no longer just an intimate betrayal. It was deliberate manipulation to sustain a public narrative with which they hoped to tie me down emotionally, legally, and socially. They needed everyone to believe that this child was mine, not out of love for the baby, but to keep the facade of the perfect family that they themselves had built intact. I could not stand still. I called my lawyer and asked him if there were any consequences for showing up and making it publicly clear that I was not the father. He told me that as long as I did not reveal private medical information, there was nothing they could use against me, especially if I did it with clear evidence. So that week I prepared everything. I brought with me copies of the court letter requesting a paternity test, excerpts from messages between Emily and Adam that I still had, and a summary signed by the investigator documenting at least 5 visits of them together to clinics, fertility centers, and even a pharmacy where they bought prenatal supplements as a couple. It was not a formal complaint, but it was a clear compilation that showed I was not crazy nor scorned nor acting out of anger as they were so keen to portray. On the day of the baby shower, I arrived with a calmness I did not know I had. It was as if all the anger I had accumulated for months had been distilled into coldness. They greeted me with forced smiles as if they did not know which version of me to expect. Emily was radiant in a tight white dress that showed off her prominent belly, smiling at every greeting as if the world was not about to come crashing down on her. As soon as she saw me, her face changed for just a second, but she quickly pretended again. She approached me, hugged me in public as if everything was fine, and whispered in my ear to please not ruin this moment. I did not answer. I just walked to the main room where there were already decorations, balloons, banners with the baby's name, one I never chose, and several people greeting me with phrases like, "What a blessing. It has changed your life, eh?" Or, "You are going to be a great dad." I took it all in silence. I did not answer any of those phrases, I just nodded. I picked up a glass of juice and waited for the most important moment to begin the speeches. As expected, Emily stood in front of everyone with a rehearsed smile and talked about the journey of becoming a mother, about the sacrifices, the waiting, the shared dreams. She said it would not have been possible without the love of her family and the support of my husband, who has been with me every step of the way, even in the most difficult ones. And that is when it was my turn to speak. Everyone asked for it, even her mother, who handed me the microphone as if offering a tribute to seal the farce. But that is not what I did. I took a breath, looked at each of the attendees, and spoke from the rawest clarity I had. I said that I was sorry to interrupt what for many was a celebration, but that I could not continue to be part of something based on a lie. That I understood that everyone had their version of things, but that mine had not been heard, and so I was going to tell it once and for all without embellishments. I said that the pregnancy they were celebrating was not the fruit of a couple's agreement, but of a unilateral decision made by Emily, who had sought out Adam, her sister's brother-in-law's younger brother, to conceive on purpose with the intention of giving that child to her sister Karen. That I never agreed, that I found out when it was already too late, and that from that day on I initiated a legal process to detach myself from a paternity that does not belong to me. And that if they were there celebrating a supposed sacrifice, it was good for them to know that it was not mine, because no one asked me. The silence was absolute. You could only hear tense breathing, the distant sound of a blender in the kitchen, and then Karen's sob, which she could not contain. Emily tried to interrupt me, but I did not give her the space. I closed my speech by handing the family lawyer who was present. Yes, they had invited the same guy who was handling Emily's divorce a folder with all the documentation. I asked him to read it calmly, and then ask himself if he really wanted to continue representing someone capable of building all of this with such calculation. I thanked everyone for their time and left. I did not look back. That same night, Adam wrote me 3 messages full of insults. He told me I was a traitor, a coward, an egomaniac. He accused me of having ruined his brother's life, his family's life, the baby's life. I did not respond. I no longer needed to defend myself. What I had to say had already been said, and the silence I left in that room was much louder than any other word I could write. I knew that from then on the war was going to escalate, but I also knew that I had laid the first stone of the collapse, and they could no longer say they did not know. Update 3. It had snowed heavily that week. The kind of snow that not only covers the streets, but also forces you to be quiet, to stay at home, and think more than you should. It was January, and with the start of the new year also came the news that, although I was expecting it, still shook me to the core. Emily had given birth. It was not she who told me. I found out through a notification from my lawyer. Just as we had agreed from the beginning, he received confirmation from the hospital as soon as Emily was registered for labor. She knew that the court order required immediate notification, so she had no way to avoid it. A boy was born. The pictures began to circulate almost immediately among close contacts. Karen posted it first with a blurry photo of the baby in Emily's arms, accompanied by a phrase that turned my stomach: "Our miracle has arrived. Thanks to those who made it possible." That hour was all I needed to read to confirm that the theater was still on. The day that child was born, I was not surrounded by balloons or flowers or nurses or diapers. I was sitting in the courtroom waiting for the authorization to take the DNA test to be formalized. I arrived with my jacket soaked from the snow, with no expectations, but with the conviction that if I did not take this step right now, it would be too late. In this country, the simple fact of being married at the time of birth automatically makes you the legal father unless you take immediate action. And that was exactly what we were doing. The judge signed the document, and that same afternoon the sample collection was scheduled. It was a quick procedure, almost surgical in its coldness: a swab, a signature, a blood sample, and that was it. I left the hospital with frozen hands and a dry throat, not because it was hard to breathe, but because everything inside me was blocked. I had not even seen the baby. I did not want to. Not for him, who was not to blame for anything, but because I knew that if I looked at him, a bond could be formed that did not belong to me. That was another type of betrayal, one against myself, and I was no longer willing to betray myself anymore. The results arrived 10 days later. My lawyer received them first and sent them to me by certified mail, an encrypted message. There was no surprise, but my hands were still trembling as I opened the document. 0%. Not a single genetic match. The child was the biological son of Adam Jones, the same one Emily had made an accomplice from the beginning. That paper signed by the laboratory was my safe conduct. In theory, that was enough to close the chapter. But theory and practice rarely go hand in hand when it comes to cutting ties that society has already assumed is certain. Because although I already knew that legally I was not the father, the system still had to officially confirm it. We presented the results at the first divorce hearing. Emily was accompanied by her lawyer, with visible dark circles, a dry face, chapped lips, like someone who has been sleeping poorly for weeks. Still, she stood firm with that look of someone who does not accept having lost, even if she knows there is nothing left to save. When the judge read the report, she said nothing, not a word. Her lawyer, on the other hand, tried to spin the story in another direction. She argued that although the child was not biologically mine during the pregnancy, I had participated in Emily's life, which according to her could be interpreted as a form of tacit recognition of paternity. My lawyer almost laughed. He handed the judge the evidence of separation from before conception, the screenshots of the messages documenting my opposition to the pregnancy, the legal separation letters, the dates of my departure from the home with proof of lease at another address, and the investigator's surveillance. All in line, all corroborated. The judge only needed 10 minutes of reading to say that there was no reason to legally link me to that child. He said it in a low but clear voice. There is no legal, biological, or voluntary relationship between the gentleman and the minor. Those words, although it may not seem like it were my resurrection, but there were still pending accounts. Emily, in a last attempt, had requested compensatory alimony, arguing that during the marriage she had completely stopped working to dedicate herself to the home and therefore had the right to financial assistance while she re-entered the workforce. Another absurd twist, because not only did we have evidence that during the marriage she had been working freelance from home with a steady income, but also the transfers she received from Adam outside of any legal contract were reflected in her accounts as recurring deposits. My lawyer, as was now customary, had everything printed, indexed, and verified. He showed not only the bank statements, but also records of payments for graphic services that Emily was still offering on platforms like Upwork and Fiverr. In short, not only was there no economic dependence, but there was also concealment of income. The judge completely dismissed her request for alimony and recommended that she seek financial advice before continuing to attempt litigation with such weak arguments. When we left the courthouse, Emily did not look at me. She walked straight ahead with her lawyer by her side, supporting her as if the weight of the world had suddenly fallen on her shoulders. And for the first time, I did not feel anger, just a kind of total detachment. That woman I saw leaving the courthouse was not the person I had shared 7 years with. She was a version of herself that I did not know and that had probably been there all along in silence, waiting for her moment to emerge. It was no longer my job to unmask her. That was now her business. My business was to close, and to close well. That night, I returned to the apartment, which was now mine, with no borrowed couch or unpacked boxes. I opened a beer, I sat on the balcony, and I watched the snow fall with a tranquility I had not felt in months. I did not feel victorious. There was nothing to celebrate. But for the first time since it all began, I did not have to defend myself from a story I did not write. And that in this war of versions was already a victory more than sufficient. Update 4. By the time summer arrived, what had started as a secret disguised as good intentions was now an out-of-control fire that had engulfed the entire Jones family. The fall was not immediate, but it was progressive, like those cracks that appear in a wall, and that at first you think are just aesthetic until one day you hear the crack, and everything comes crashing down. After the paternity hearing and the flat rejection of alimony, Emily tried to retreat. She remained silent on social media. She stopped talking about our baby and completely avoided mentioning my name, even in legal contexts. But the story had already gotten out of her control. Her sister Karen, the same one who for months asked me for empathy and maturity, now faced a much bigger problem than her supposed inability to conceive. Her own marriage was falling apart. And what remained underneath was a quagmire of secrets, betrayals, and consequences that no one wanted to foresee. The first thing to collapse was the prenuptial agreement between Karen and Dave. Apparently, when they got married, Dave insisted, at the suggestion of his father, who at the time managed a large part of the family assets, that they sign an agreement that would protect the joint estate in case of infidelity. At the time, Karen had no problem because, as she said, that is only for unfaithful wives, not for us who are different. But it turns out that the contract also included a specific clause to protect the family business resources if either of them committed acts that publicly compromised the family name or the company's name. And the fact that his wife had lent herself to concocting a pregnancy behind her husband's back, using his own brother as an accomplice with involuntary media coverage, included fit perfectly into that category. I did not find out about all this at once, of course. They were leaks that reached me through acquaintances' third-party comments that began to surface as soon as it was known that Adam had been fired from the family business. Yes, just as I imagined, Dave not only was not aware that his younger brother had been participating in that intimate donation, but he also discovered that Adam had been using company resources to cover expenses related to the pregnancy. It was not hard to follow the trail: payments to clinics, transfers to Emily, hotel reservations during the fertile period, all from accounts that apparently were poorly audited. When they confronted him in an internal meeting, Adam tried to justify himself by saying it was for the family, that the baby would change everything, but no one believed him. Dave, humiliated and furious, fired him from the company and formally vetoed him from any future shareholding. Adam also received a summons for corporate fraud, and although it was not a huge sum, it was enough to open a formal investigation and freeze his accounts for an indefinite period. Karen, in the midst of all this, tried to cling to the only burning nail: she had left the baby, despite the fact that the child was not legally hers. And this is where things get even more tangled. She tried to register the baby as an informal adopted child, something that is not only legally unsustainable in the United States, but also left her completely exposed to a deeper problem. The biological mother was still Emily, and the legal father by default had to be Adam. But both were in the middle of a divorce with no intention of raising him together. What happened next was almost inevitable. Karen filed a lawsuit against Adam for emotional distress, breach of moral contract, and violation of marital duty, partially supported by the prenuptial agreement and a series of emails in which Adam told her that he would not get involved with Emily again because this is between you and me. What she did not know was that this phrase was going to become a double-edged sword. The lawsuit was admitted by the judge partly because the case had become so mediatic within the county that any attempt to discredit it only made things worse. And so what at first was a bedroom problem among four adults was now a business, legal, public, and family dispute. The local press began to rumor, especially when the court documents were leaked on a neighborhood forum. The story was there, raw and unadorned. A woman who lent herself to a surrogate pregnancy without her partner's consent, a younger brother who used corporate resources to facilitate the act, a betrayed wife who ended up litigating for her husband's assets, and a man, me, who, having been the first to speak now, seemed to be the only one who had come out with his head held high. And yet that did not mean I felt at peace. What surprised me most in those days was how messages began to arrive from people who had previously looked at me with disdain, who had distanced themselves out of respect for Emily's process. Neighbors, family, friends, even a couple of acquaintances from Emily's work who had deleted me from social media without explanation wrote to me to apologize or to tell me they did not know everything that was going on. One of the most significant came from Emily's mother, a woman with whom I never had a close relationship, but who used to be cordial. She sent me a short email with no greetings or elaborate excuses. It just said, "I am sorry for how things turned out. We should never have assumed you were the problem. I hope you are well." I did not reply, not because I held a grudge, but because I no longer had the space to clean up others' messes. Let everyone take care of their own ruins. In parallel, my life began to take on a different rhythm. I moved to a small apartment further north of the city, away from the circles where all this had taken place. I started working with an independent carpenter who needed help with administration and logistics, and together we set up a workshop that gradually grew. Ironically, while they were tearing each other apart amidst lies and cross lawsuits, I was finally starting to build something real. And I did not need anyone to see it or to congratulate me or to remind me of what I had lost. Because what I lost in reality was a weight I had been carrying for years without realizing it. I have not seen Emily in person since the last hearing. According to her social media profile, she lives with her parents without a stable job, with the baby who, and this is perhaps the saddest part, is now a kind of axis without direction, surrounded by adults who still cannot agree on who should raise him, support him, or publicly acknowledge him. The only thing I know for sure is that I have nothing to do with it. And if anyone ever asks me again why I left, why I disengaged, I will show them the chain of consequences that followed their lie, and I will tell them calmly, I did not leave, I survived. Final update. A little over a year had passed since Emily looked me in the eyes and asked me to sign as the father of a child that was not mine, as if what she was asking was a weightless formality. The city had already changed seasons several times since then, and with each change, I felt less tied to everything I once considered home. In that time, life settled into a slow but steady rhythm, without stridency or grand celebrations, just with that sense of peace that is built on well-healed scars. And although I was never one to tell stories seeking revenge, the truth is that if this was a battle, and it was, I not only survived, I won. Not with blows or shouts, but by letting the truth do its work. Because truths do not always arrive like lightning, sometimes they seep in like water that corrodes until there is nothing left standing. The last time I heard about Emily was from an indirect source. A former co-worker of hers who used to run into me at local entrepreneurship fairs wrote to tell me that she had tried to apply for a position at the city hall, but that her legal history left her out of the process. It was not that she had a criminal record that never went that far, but the paternity lawsuit, the judicial rejection, the public documents, and the subsequent IRS audit for the undeclared deposits from Adam had left her marked. More than one internal record carried her name as a reputational risk. That was the exact word, risk. I suppose there is no worse condemnation for someone who built such a perfect lie than to realize that now everything she touches is interpreted as suspicious. She no longer had the facade that protected her. She could no longer use my name to sustain the farce. Karen, for her part, did not come out unscathed either. Although she managed to get the judge to recognize the violation of the prenuptial agreement, the process wore her out so much that when she was finally granted financial compensation, Dave had already formally filed for divorce and had moved to another state. I heard that he sold the family home without telling Karen anything until the sold sign appeared in front of the garden. He left her with nothing more than what the agreement required. What seemed to be the climax of her life plan to start a family, to raise a child with her husband, ended up being a daily reminder of everything that cannot be forced by whim. The child did not call her mom, did not sleep with her, did not eat from her hand. He had a biological mother and a biological father who now barely tolerated each other. Karen was just an uncomfortable spectator of the same script she helped write. Adam disappeared from the radar for months. The last I heard was that he was living with a distant cousin in North Carolina doing odd residential maintenance jobs while trying to sort out his tax issues. The money he had diverted from the company was repaid by his father, who had to sell part of his stake to avoid a larger investigation. The family business, one that was once a source of pride, now operated under a different management and another name. The Jones name, at least in the sector where they worked, became synonymous with poorly managed chaos. And as for the child, the court finally established shared custody between Emily and Adam, with supervised visits for Karen at Adam's request, who alleged that she tried to manipulate the maternity of his son from before he was born. The irony of it all is that none of the adults involved seemed to really want to assume the role of father or mother. The child was an emotional burden, an uncomfortable reminder, and that was the most tragic part of all. I, in the meantime, continued to build in silence. The workshop I opened with Marcus the carpenter grew more than we expected. We got a proposal to open a second point of sale, and with effort we managed to open a small shop in the Westwood shopping district. I felt useful, focused, free. I met someone. It was not immediate or intentional. We crossed paths at an entrepreneur's fair where she had a stand of handmade ceramics. Her name was Rachel. I did not tell her my story right away. I just told her I was coming from closing a difficult chapter. She did not ask for more. You could tell she had also lived through her own things. Our relationship developed without expectations, without urgency. With her, I discovered that love does not have to hurt or make noise to be real. Over time, Rachel and I decided to move in together to a small house on the outskirts where silence is not a sign of tension, but of peace. There, among carved wood and handmade coffee cups, I felt again that I had a life of my own, one where I was not a secondary character in other stories. I started therapy not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to understand why I had allowed so much before setting boundaries. I learned to name things: emotional manipulation, gaslighting, unilateral sacrifice. I learned that you do not always have to shout to defend yourself, but that silence cannot be eternal either. And most importantly, I learned to forgive myself, not for having trusted, but for having taken so long to react. I never sought revenge in the traditional sense. I did not need to see them ruined. I just needed to come out clean. That my name, my story, my version of the events would not be lost among their rehearsed speeches. And I think I succeeded because in the end, while they struggled to keep alive a lie that got out of their hands, I simply told the truth. Calmly, with evidence, with patience. And now that I see it with distance, I understand that there is no punishment more severe than that each one has to live with the exact weight of what they did without being able to blame anyone else. Emily painted me as the villain for not wanting to be the father of a child that was not mine. Today, if anyone asks, no one doubts who is who in this story. No one needs explanations or clarifications or documents because the truth, even if it is delayed, always finds a way to make itself heard. And sometimes, as in my case, it does so in the only language that liars cannot manipulate: the silence of one who no longer has anything to prove.